All right, hi all. Thank you for joining us for this sub-area meeting for the South San Francisco General Plan Update process. We'll tell you a lot more about it here shortly. My name is Dave Javid with Plan to Place. I'm part of the consultant team. The slide you see in front of you right now are for those that are dialing in that would like to access the Spanish-speaking live interpretation version of this presentation. We do have a live interpreter. This is directions for those that need it, access that, obviously in Spanish, so that they can see it and easily move into that room. So with that, if we want to go to the next slide, Eric. Just want to give you a quick overview of how we're hoping to do the facilitation of this discussion tonight. We're hoping to use the chat window on the right-hand side, you'll see on this slide, where you can be fielding or sending us any questions, comments as the presentation is going that we could then address as we have pauses in the presentation where we're going to have a question and answer period and do a couple polls. And then when we get to that section as well, if you would rather actually verbalize or give us a verbal comment, you could use the hand raising function, which is on the bottom of your window, little blue hand that'll alert me that you would like to speak, and we could unmute you if you can't unmute yourself and allow you time to provide comment. And if you're calling in, you could also dial *9 and that will actually also activate that, that function. And then Eric will just describe this shortly, but we'll have opportunities for Q&A throughout, and then we're also going to move into small groups where we'll have a larger discussion or a smaller discussion about each one of the topics and be able to dive in a little deeper. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric to get us started. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Dave, and good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Yurkovich. I'm Associate Principal at Ramey & Associates, and we've been working with the City of South San Francisco as part of a team to help redevelop the city's general plan. And tonight we're going to be leading kind of the third of our community workshops around land use alternatives that we've been rolling out over the last week and a half across the city. This is really an exciting opportunity for us to kind of come together to really talk about the future of South San Francisco overall and really focus tonight on those land use alternatives and then the specific policies and strategies and implementation actions that can really help implement the vision that you all want to see for South San Francisco. I'm going to do an overview presentation during which I'll talk about what the general plan is, what the land use alternatives are, and what they are specifically for the downtown area. We'll do polling throughout that. And then we're actually going to break out into small group discussions, into breakout rooms, and where you'll be able to kind of interact with your peers and a facilitator and talk about those land use alternatives together. And then finally, we'll do a wrap up where we report back what we've heard in those small group discussions and then tell you about the next steps. Really the purpose of these meetings tonight is to give you kind of a brief overview of where we are in the process and to review and solicit feedback on the land use alternatives specifically. And again, we're going to spend the majority of our time really focused on that tonight. But before we start, we actually want to really acknowledge that a few of you might be here because you saw a petition about redeveloping the Cypress and Pine Park as high-density housing in the future. And we want to kind of talk through that and clarify what those maps are showing in that area. And we're going to do that first because I want to make sure that you all recognize what's happening on those maps. So the first thing I just want to mention that this is the existing park open space within the downtown area of South San Francisco. The Cypress and Pine Park is kind of in this northeast area here, and you have the City Hall play lot. We're going to talk about this a little later in the presentation, but this is one of the most park-deficient neighborhoods across the entire city of South San Francisco. Now, we showed a series of alternatives starting last week that looked like this. And it showed that both of those two parks are on the maps, and you can see where they're circled in these two areas. But what's hard to see is that they're underneath the orange and the purple that are right next to them. So it looks like they're not there anymore, but they're really just obstructed from view. And I just want to clarify that it was not the intent to show these as redeveloped parks and open space areas. So what we've done tonight for clarification is reproduce the map so that you can clearly see where those parks are in the maps, so that you can clearly see where the intent is not to show those parks redeveloping into high density housing or any other use in the future. And we want to make this clarification early on, so if you're concerned about this issue, that you know that we've seen this issue, recognized it, and we've tried to fix the map so it better reflects everyone's vision for the area. While we talked specifically about parks, I think we've heard a lot of other issues in this area, and we want to also make sure that they're brought to the forefront as well. And we are going to talk through some of these issues later in the presentation, but we've heard not just tonight, but across multiple meetings that the issues of neighborhood gentrification and displacement are really important to you. The park maintenance, preservation of open space, and the creation of new open space is really important in the downtown area. The amount and scale of development is a critical issue that you guys have raised in the past. And things like the need for a youth center or youth-focused activities are really important given the demographic composition of the folks who are living here and that younger population who are living in the downtown sub-area. We did a series of meetings at the sub-area scale last fall, and there's a summary here on the chart of that meeting here on the chart, and you can see what folks said at that meeting, what some of those key issues were, what some of those opportunities were. And so we just wanted to let you all know that we're here, we heard, and we want to try to make sure that the maps are clear and that the conversation is grounded in where we want to head together as a team into the future. So with that little prelude, I'm going to go ahead and start going through the main presentation for tonight. So many of you might ask what Shape SSF is. It's really the update of the city's general plan, zoning code, EIR, and climate action plan. The purpose of the general plan is really, it's kind of a long-range policy document that guides future actions about things like policy decisions that we make, but also about future development applications within South San Francisco. The general plan process really allows the community to come together to create a shared vision for the future. We presented that out to at the citywide workshop on last Tuesday evening, and I would recommend that you go back and take a look at that community vision and hear a little bit more about that, because we're not going to get into that this evening. We've heard a lot through our community conversations about what those strengths are and what are the key assets within South San Francisco that we want to preserve moving forward in the future. And then also about new ideas and new topics of concern and issues that we want to address in this update of the general plan. Those are things like healthy communities, social equity, sustainability, and climate justice. The general plan itself really rests on the work that has been done over the past decade within South San Francisco. It's our job as a planning team to really lift up the key ideas, the key themes, the specific projects that are within all of these documents into the general plan itself. And some of these, like the downtown station area specific plan, have a real strong relationship to what we're showing tonight in terms of the land use alternatives, as do things like the Active South City, which is the bike and pedestrian plan update. This graphic really shows where we are in the overall planning timeline for the general plan update. We started last year, and we did a series of kind of exploration and discovery, both quantitative, where we looked at data, reviewed it. We talked to you as a community about what some of your key issues and what you thought some of the key assets were and what some of the opportunities were, and some of the challenges that you wanted to see addressed in the general plan. We took all that information and drafted that series of that vision statement and series of guiding principles. And now we're here tonight to kind of roll that up into the land use alternatives and talk specifically about those alternatives tonight. So once we develop those alternatives, we'll kind of create a final land use plan. We'll develop policy to kind of implement the land use policy, and then we'll draft the general plan, which will be out next year with subsequent releases of the zoning code, climate action plan, and EIR in the summer of next year. So I'm going to give just a very quick overview of what a land use alternative is in particular. The purpose of the land use alternatives is really to understand and test different land use and design patterns, to really understand the policy trade-offs between different choices that we make in the land use alternatives. This really helps us to make those informed choices about the future, and it helps us to design the right policy to implement the land use element of the general plan. This could be things related to parks or to housing protection and housing preservation within the city. These land use alternatives really test kind of three big ideas. The first is the kind of the pattern and the distribution of overall land uses, both across the citywide, but then also in the smaller sub-areas. These land use alternatives also talk about the mix of uses. So what do we want to see along Grand Avenue or along Linden Avenue? What are the kinds of mixes and the types of mixes of uses that we would like to see in those areas? And then they also talk about the relative intensity of those land uses. So kind of from a high to a medium to a low intensity. So we can kind of understand, and when we pull all those things together, we can kind of evaluate the balance of jobs and housing, the changes to how people travel, and some of the sustainability outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions. These alternatives are really built with something that we call place types. These place types represent different land uses that happen within South San Francisco. So on the left-hand side, you see the residential medium, which is a type of land use that exists, a residential type of land use that exists in the city. In addition to those residential uses, there are commercial uses. Those are things like business and technology park, or the kind of the life sciences and biotech uses that you see in the east of 101 area. There's also mixed use type, which you see along, say, Grand Avenue, where you have a mix on one single parcel. You might have retail and commercial space on the ground floor of a building, and then retail or residential or office above it in the upper floors of that building. And then we're also testing some new types that you don't see necessarily in South San Francisco. And that includes things like the mixed industrial high, which is a higher intensity industrial, which you won't see in the downtown area tonight, but you will see in the Lindenville and east of 101 alternatives. So we're moving through this process from alternatives all the way out to zoning next year. Right now, we're in the process of testing these three alternatives where we're gathering feedback through a series of community meetings. Once we pull all that information together, we'll create one final general plan map, which will be the land use map that goes in the general plan, which will be developed later in the summer and early fall of this year. Once that general plan land use map is established, we'll then go and develop the zoning designations that are associated with it. Those are the things like the building heights, the bulk and the intensity of those buildings and their setbacks, what's the required open space, and how much parking is provided on those individual parcels. So that more detailed design standards will come early next year. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on how we create the alternatives. We go through a series of background analysis to really understand the conditions in each neighborhood. We did that quantitatively through existing conditions analysis, but also qualitatively through these different sub-area meetings that we held last year. We really know that downtown's kind of the mixed-use heart of the city along Grand Avenue, with commercial corridors along Linden. It houses about 20% of the city's population and about 5% of the city's jobs already, and it has a really diverse mix of uses across the entire sub-area, including major public uses like City Hall and the Grand Avenue Library. You can see that the downtown sub-area has about 12,000 people who live there currently, which is about about a fifth of the city's population overall. And specifically within the sub-area, the residents tend to be younger and also are more likely to identify as Latino or Hispanic residents than in other sub-areas of South San Francisco. A couple of other key metrics that we look at in terms of the downtown itself is that while there's about 3,500 housing units in the downtown area, and about those 12,000 housing units, there's about 3.5 people living per household, which is higher than the citywide average of about 3.2 people living per household. So it suggests that more people are living together in larger families and in smaller units. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we all recognize that downtown is one of the most parks poor neighborhoods within South San Francisco. It only has about 1.6 acres of existing park space in the city, and only about half of the city's population are within a short walk of a downtown park. And so we'll be talking specifically about that this evening. This map shows the mix of land. This is the land use map for the downtown. So this shows what's the existing land use within the downtown area. And you can see from the map and the diversity of colors on the map, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, the grays, the blues, the greens, that shows that sort of that great mix of uses and that characteristic of the downtown is having all of those uses all kind of combined together into a small area. About half of the area itself is single family residential as you start to move towards Chestnut Avenue towards Chestnut Avenue on the western edge of downtown. But in the downtown area around the core of Grand Avenue, it's a lot of retail services and a mixed use along Grand Avenue. As I mentioned, that downtown has about 2,000 jobs within the downtown area. This is about 4% or a little less than 5% of the city's overall jobs numbers. And now these are from 2018, so these are all pre-pandemic. And so we're not sure exactly what the composition of jobs is right now, but this is the most recent baseline of data that we have available to us at this time. We know that a lot of those jobs are in things like arts, accommodation, food service, retail trade, so retail jobs, but also administrative and support services, healthcare, and education. So all those things all those uses that you can see when you walk around downtown South San Francisco. During those sub-area meetings, we started to talk about and collect up what people felt were some of the key issues within the area, and we wanted to reflect some of those back to you tonight. We heard in some of those meetings that there's limited park access, which I've mentioned a couple times. We also know that there's a lot of housing and commercial businesses that are at risk to displacement, so we want to lift that up as a key issue. We also heard that parking and traffic is a really big concern in the downtown area. And so we're going to launch a poll now to kind of hear from you. It's a longer list of those issues, but we're going to kind of hear from you with that poll what you think some of the key issues are in just the downtown area now. And I'll hand it back to Dave to do that.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, before we do that, we want to do a quick demographics poll. Eric, you were on a roll, so I didn't want to interrupt. We sometimes do that at the beginning, but this is as good a time as any. So we just want to get a sense of where you all are coming from, what neighborhood you might be from, and just kind of some basic demographics. So I'm going to launch that here first. So you should see that pop up on your screen.
Right.
If you can please take a couple seconds to fill this out, and I'll share this back out with everyone. We'll give it maybe 10 more seconds. Yeah, and these polls are really meant for meeting participants. So city staff, I'm sure you're probably aware, but you don't need to worry about taking this poll. So you'll see the results. The results will just reflect members of the public that are dialing in. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. Looks like we got about almost 30 participants. I'm going to share that out with you all to take a quick look at. Looks like we got some great diverse representation from throughout the city. Obviously, this being the downtown sub-area meeting, makes sense to have more folks from that group with us or from that neighborhood. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out now, and we'll go. I wanted to do one other poll, if you don't mind, just to get a sense of previous engagement activities that you've also been involved with, and then we'll do the key issues. So here comes that one. We'll make it quick. Just to get a sense of your kind of general background, understanding of the project, and kind of where we've been as we move into the smaller group meetings as well. We'll make this one real quick. Okay, we'll end this one. Excellent. Looks like a lot of representation from those that took the surveys, which is great. We'd love to see that. And many folks have also joined us at workshops, sub-area meetings, so a good cross-section of all of that. And now I'm going to move to the key issues survey that Eric mentioned earlier. So here comes that poll. If you can please take a few seconds to take that, and we can talk through some of the results here as well.
So in this poll, we're really asking you to kind of identify what you think are the two most important issues. All of these are important issues we recognize through our conversations that we've had through this process and also through the downtown stationary specific planning process. So we just wanted to kind of get an understanding what you think are the most important of those issues.
Great, maybe 5 more seconds here. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We can take a quick look. Interesting. Yeah, good cross-section results. Housing displacement and lack of affordability of housing, pretty related there. Seem to be voted on the most, followed by lack of park space, but limited parking as well is mixed in. The only thing, interestingly enough, that didn't actually come up as an issue is traffic congestion, which in other neighborhoods we actually heard a lot about. So interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to take that. Any follow-up questions on any of this before we move forward? You could do that through the chat or raise your hand, or we can follow up here. And we'll have plenty of opportunity to have in-depth conversations with you while we move towards the small groups. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so back to you, Eric.
Thanks, David, and sorry for blowing through the original poll earlier.
No problem at all.
Okay, so in addition to sort of the issues and some of that data analysis that we did, we also kind of look at what the current policy is in terms of land use for the downtown area. And so this map shows kind of a summary of what's in the current general plan now, which was adopted comprehensively last time in 1999, but updated in 2015 to reflect the downtown station area specific plan in particular. The stationary specific plan really did a few things. The first, it really kind of promoted the city in this part of South San Francisco as the heart of the community with that kind of mixed use core along Grand Avenue, but then also with some transit orientation. So kind of higher density development near where the Caltrain station, across the 101 from the Caltrain station. 2, it really kind of focused on creating a mix of uses like the downtown is now, to add housing, to keep retail and services, to keep all of that mix and adding new things like new open space and parks to complement those uses in the downtown area. 3, it really kind of promoted infill development, intensification, and reuse. So really thinking about what some of those parcels are and some of those areas that could accommodate housing, including affordable housing or new park space within the downtown area. And then it really looked at kind of increasing the linkages from downtown to other parts of South San Francisco, like east of 101 on the eastern edge to Sign Hill, to Lindenville to the south and Orange Park. So all of those, it kind of looked at all of those things together and really kind of implemented the vision that was established as part of the downtown station area specific plan. Also, as part of our work and our analysis, we did some market conditions work, and that we sort of recognized that over the last 10 years that biotechnology and life sciences have been one of the primary drivers of growth and change within the city. But there's also still been kind of the maintenance of a strong demand for what we call production, distribution, and repair facilities. Otherwise, you might call those industrial uses. You might see those as a gray on the map. And while the overall proportion of those jobs has declined over the last 10 years, it's still about 1/5 of the jobs within South San Francisco are those types of employment. And that there will be an opportunity to keep adding retail and service and hospitality uses, particularly as we add incremental households and workers within the different sub-areas of the city. We also have to recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic has had unprecedented issues, not just here in South San Francisco, but across the country and across the globe. There's unprecedented unemployment rates. I think it's about 14% was the last I saw in South San Francisco. We also know that there's been diminished demand for retail and hospitality and other uses that will take some time to recover over time, and that these have had real implications for the fiscal health of cities who are maybe already dealing with budget shortfalls. So those are some of those kind of things that we know. We also know that the city has a lot of competitive assets that it can build on in terms of short-term economic recovery into kind of long-term economic growth. And so as we think about the general plan, we want to think about how to build off those assets moving into the future. There are a lot of things we just don't know yet about the pandemic and its long-term effects. So what the economic and market conditions will be like 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, no one's quite certain as of yet. And we know that the pandemic has caused a lot of social changes. So how we work in a lot of cases, how we travel have changed significantly over the last several months. And so we really don't know how that's going to change in the future. And so we're always thinking about these things as we start to design the land use alternatives. In addition to the kind of the economic market, we also looked at the housing market in South San Francisco. Over the last 5 years, from 2015 to about 2020, or to the end of 2019, the city permitted almost 1,000 housing units, so 977 housing units. That accommodated about half of what we call the regional housing needs assessment. The regional housing needs assessment is part of an 8-year cycle that the state and region ask each community within California to accommodate a certain amount of housing production and growth, consistent with employment trends and other regional trends. And so the current regional housing needs assessment process is underway right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how much new housing South San Francisco will be asked to accommodate in the future. We've heard it's going to be something like between 2 to 4 times the current regional housing needs assessment allocation. So that would be a range of 3,700 units to 7,400 units between 2020 and 2030, so over the next 8 years. But the general plan is really looking out at 2 or 3 of these regional housing needs assessment cycles. And so we're looking at a range of about 11,000 to 22,000 housing units. So we can get a sense of what that might look like over time. So now the land use alternatives for the downtown area. So I'm going to put up the vision and policy. This vision statement for the downtown area really relies on the work that was done around the downtown area, the downtown station area specific plan. And it really, and I'm going to read it off, and then we're going to launch a poll to see how you feel about that vision. So it's a revitalized downtown that promotes new residential, mixed use, and employment uses, focuses new improvements on Grand Avenue, and improves pedestrian bicycle connections to Caltrain and east of 101 through the implementation of the downtown station area specific plan. And so with that, we're going to launch a poll, and we're going to ask you, just at a high level, do you kind of agree, strongly agree with this statement? Do you strongly disagree with this statement? Are you somewhere in between? And again, this really relies on the vision that was outlined in that downtown station area specific plan. We'll give you all one more second to weigh in, and then we'll share the results.
Yep, almost there. Great. Looks like we got almost 25 participants. And sharing the results now with you all.
Interesting.
Yeah, all across the board. All across the board. And this is definitely something we could dive into deeper as we do the breakout groups, unless there's anything in particular that folks had a question or comment about. Eric, I did see one question come in asking if this study will differentiate between housing and affordable housing need. I know you're going to get into that a little bit more, but do you want to address that now?
So the regional housing needs assessment that I mentioned earlier and talked about earlier requires the city to provide housing at different affordability levels, different income levels. So from low income to very low income to moderate income households. So when the city is looking at permitting new housing, it's also looking at the affordability and the income levels for all of those housing as well, because those are part of the targets that are required within that regional housing needs assessment.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
I think that's the only comment we got. So if you want to go ahead and move forward, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second to just reflect a little bit, though, on the distribution of responses to this. This vision statement really relies on the downtown specific plan, and I think what I saw in those responses is kind of across the board that we see this distribution from people who strongly disagree with it to strongly agree with it, almost split evenly across the board. And I think for those who agree and disagree or who are in between, when we get to the small group discussions, I'd like you all to think about that. It's not one of the discussion questions we're going to start with, but I think it would be good for us as facilitators to start with that for discussion tonight and to understand why people feel one way or the other about this vision statement. I think that's a good place to start.
That's a good point, Eric. We had one more comment come through that downtown has taken the brunt of high-rise building, and San Francisco did not pass the tax, which affects Caltrans' continued service. That was just a comment that came through the chat, so just thought I'd put that in the mix.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, all yours.
Thanks. All right, so as I mentioned, the land use alternatives really test different ideas tonight. There's, I saw at least one question in the chat, which was about what's the land use plan? Well, there isn't one right now. We're testing different ideas in these land use alternatives. We can mix and match. We can look at new ideas, and we'll talk about that when we get to the small group discussions. But tonight, when I go through the alternatives, we're really testing these 5 specific ideas in the downtown area. So one is really creating this mixed-use transit-oriented community adjacent to Caltrain, which is part of the vision of that downtown stationary specific plan. The second is really allowing downtowns, kind of that mixed-use pattern of the downtown to continue south towards Lindenville to really reinforce downtown and kind of support the businesses that are downtown with mixed-use residential development down to Colma Creek. The third thing we looked at very specifically tonight is developing a mixed-use corridor along North Airport Boulevard. And then along that kind of that gateway boulevard from kind of sister cities down into the downtown area, really creating a small neighborhood serving center at Linden and North Airport Boulevard. And across all the alternatives, we're always thinking about how to improve connectivity, both within the district, but also how it connects to other areas of the city as well. So you see those lines on the map showing those changes in connectivity. As I mentioned earlier, these alternatives are really built on these different place types that we call these building blocks. These are going to represent the colors that you see on the maps tonight. And so these images are intended to illustrate what they look like, and what those types are, those place types are in downtown. So this shows kind of high density mixed use, which is the allowed use that's allowed currently along Grand Avenue, but then also near the Caltrain station adjacent to the 101 corridor. The second is kind of a medium density mixed use, which is allowed that you'll be able to see that around the downtown area and then also along Airport Boulevard as well. You'll also see along Linden Avenue, for example, low intensity mixed use. So you can kind of see we're trying to, as we talked about earlier, kind of this mix of uses, but then also the intensity of uses. So you'll see those on the maps that we're presenting tonight, and you can talk about it in your small groups. And then finally, there's a series of not just mixed use types, but also residential types. So you'll see what's called residential high on the alternatives. This is kind of the darker orange that you'll see on the maps. And this are some images showing what it could look like. You'll also see medium density residential, which is a lighter orange that you'll also see on those maps. You can see as we're going down in kind of height and scale with each of these different types. And then finally, in all cases, I think I want to be clear that when we're thinking about any sort of increase in any sort of higher density housing, even whether it's medium density or higher density, we're always thinking about the transitions to the single family neighborhoods, but also to kind of those neighborhoods which are sort of what we would call medium density, that have a mix of 2, 3, 4plexes, townhomes, and all those kind of smaller multifamily units. So in all these cases, we'll be thinking about how to transition between areas that are a little higher intensity and areas that are a little lower intensity, and how but we can do that both with building strategies as well as landscaping strategies. So now with that, I'll kind of walk through those land use alternatives. So this is alternative 1. It really builds on this downtown station area specific plan, maintaining Grand Avenue as that kind of retail mixed use core of South San Francisco. It also really creates this mixed use transit oriented community at the Caltrain station. So this is all this darker purple that you can kind of see over here on the eastern edge of the downtown area. As I mentioned earlier, we're testing this idea of allowing mixed use to come down to Coma Creek, which would support the addition of new mixed use and residential housing adjacent to the downtown to kind of support those downtown businesses and kind of reinforce the character of the downtown area. And then also I mentioned earlier that one of the things we tested was this idea of a kind of a gateway another gateway into the downtown area. So from sister cities north along Airport Boulevard, kind of a mixed use corridor coming down into the downtown area. This alternative adds some amount of additional housing areas because we've shown that these areas which are currently sort of industrial or commercial mixed use down here as having more residential in particular. The second alternative really tests 2 different ideas from alternative 1. The first is creating this sort of neighborhood center up here at the junction of Linden and Airport Boulevard. And so this would be kind of creating a smaller neighborhood center with supporting commercial and retail uses. There's open space in the area, but also some housing in that area. The other thing it tests is this idea of allowing the kind of the commercial mixed use that's along Linden to support retail and services along the bottom floor and maybe housing over top in that area overall. But largely the remainder of the downtown stays the same. And then finally, alternative number 3, the biggest difference in this alternative is allowing a higher intensity mixed use residential down here south of Railroad Avenue down to Coma Creek. Again, to both reinforce downtown, but then also leverage improvements that in the kind of the transformation of Coma Creek over time. And this alternative kind of would add the most sort of housing units to the area. This slide really shows all 3 alternatives together, and I'm not going to go through each of those alternatives. You'll be able to do that with your small group facilitator in just a moment, but it kind of illustrates all 3 alternatives lined up against each other and shown next to each other. I want to just point out for folks who maybe joined us late, related to this question about the redevelopment of the parks in this area, in the downtown area. I think what we wanted to do is just to make sure that the maps were clear and to show that we were not redeveloping, say, the Cypress and Pine play lot and also the downtown play lot, which were kind of hidden underneath the other colors above it. And we apologize for that, but we want to make sure that you can clearly see them on these maps so that they're part of that discussion. In addition to the kind of land use changes, you'll see on that maps a series of lines that show some different mobility improvements within the downtown area. These include things like the underpass, the Caltrain underpass to downtown, better access to Colma Creek, and then some complete streets and pedestrian and bicycle-oriented streets within the area itself. So after all that, we wanted just to lay out some kind of the opportunities and some of the challenges with these different alternatives so that we can have a more robust discussion about those together. So really there's opportunities here to kind of reinforce downtown as the heart of South San Francisco by adding and producing new housing affordable to workforce people, but also affordable to lower income households. We can also help kind of create places where we support better transit ridership, whether it's Caltrain or other transit service, which might be available in the downtown area. And then we see there's a real opportunity to think about how we can create new open spaces in the downtown, create great places for people to gather and socialize in downtown over time. And really to build on Grand Avenue as a place to kind of gather and be together. I think it's very clear, and we've heard throughout, that there are real challenges associated with displacement of lower income residents, particularly the Latino population who's in downtown. There's also the potential for displacement of commercial and industrial businesses within those areas. So if you are adding housing into downtown, you're likely displacing an existing business of one sort or another. We also recognize that there's real limited park and open space. So we're looking for ideas for how to support kind of a distributed park and open space network in the downtown area overall. And so with that, I'm going to pause. We are going to launch a poll in which we're going to ask you two questions. The first, and Dave, you can go ahead and launch this when you have a second. The first is really at this moment in time, and we're not going to hold you to this, just to see what your preference is in terms of these different alternatives, if there is any. And the second, we want to know how important it is to you that future jobs and housing are balanced across South San Francisco. And I'll say that we're not going to hold you to these votes. You're going to have an opportunity to talk in small groups about them, to learn what your colleagues and neighbors and friends are saying about them as well, and refine it. But we just kind of want to get a sense now before we go into our small group discussions. And at the same time, I'm going to open up the chat and see if there are any questions. If anyone want to ask any questions specifically before we go into the small groups, I'm happy to answer any of those that you have. And I think we could probably show the results of the survey now, Dave.
Yeah, haven't got a whole lot. I'm just going to give a few more seconds. Looks like a few are coming in now, maybe just reading through the questions. So we'll give it 5 more seconds. Eric, you do have 3 questions that have popped up. Now 4 in the chat. Do you see those? You want me to read those out for you?
I'm going to go back. I think there was a question about showing the alternatives. So I'll put the 3 alternatives back up before we go into the small groups.
Great. Here's the results real quick if we want to take a quick look at these together.
So that's great. Thanks, Dave. So you can see that about a quarter of the respondents said either the general plan, or about half said either the general plan or alternative 1, which are probably pretty closely aligned. And then about half said alternative 3, which shows that increase in affordable housing, particularly south towards Colma Creek. You can see that darker purple area south of Railroad down to Colma Creek.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing results, and we'll take a few questions that are rolling in through chat.
Yeah, and I'll just say that about 2/3 of the respondents said that balancing jobs and housing was either very important or extremely important. And I know that someone in the chat mentioned that they voted for the wrong one. That's okay. We're not holding you to these particular responses. We're going to have folks. We're going to have a discussion in the small groups.
Yeah, Eric, and I saw that you pulled up this slide, which is great. We had one. Looks like Alexander asked if we can pull up this slide, and there was a follow-up asking for us to summarize the 3 alternatives. So maybe we can just give folks a real quick recap again with this slide.
Yeah, totally.
Bizarre.
So the things that are the same about all the alternatives. I think that's probably the simplest place to start, is they all kind of maintain Grand Avenue as that higher density mixed use core consistent with the vision of the downtown station area plan. There's not any change there. They all kind of maintain a core of kind of higher intensity mixed use right near the Caltrain station, that kind of transit oriented community right near that transit station. So again, consistent with the downtown station area plan. Then they all kind of maintain that network of neighborhoods all around Grand Avenue. So those oranges and yellows, those are all consistent with the downtown area specific plan. So how they differ from that existing general plan and the specific plan is that along Airport Boulevard, we have kind of a mixed use corridor down into downtown, that gateway, and you can see that across all three alternatives. In alternatives 2 and 3, though, we add a small kind of mixed use center at Airport and North Linden Avenue up here in the northern section here. And you can see that across alternatives 2 and 3. And then finally, the other kind of bigger change is this really allowing kind of mixed use down to Colma Creek. So in alternatives 1 and 2, that shows kind of a medium density mixed use down to Colma Creek to really kind of reinforce that pattern of downtown, of the mix of uses, that residential pattern, to kind of reinforce downtown, support the downtown pattern, and kind of create more kind of transit accessible residential. And then in alternative 3, we show that as a kind of a higher intensity mixed use of residential.
Great, thanks, Eric. We had a kind of higher end question of what will happen to homes and businesses that don't fit into these alternatives.
So the long-term vision is, as I think I mentioned earlier, what's on the ground now and the long-term vision aren't always fully aligned within planning documents. So what's there now doesn't have to change and won't be required to change, and nobody will force those individual properties to change over time. And so the land use alternatives kind of illustrate that vision. A lot of this, as I mentioned before, was kind of part of the vision that was established as the downtown specific planning process about what that might look like in the future. But none of those properties or parcels are going to be required to redevelop or change over in any way. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Great, thanks, Eric. Kayla had a question if we have projections for housing displacement that might occur for alternative.
We don't do specific projections for housing displacement, but we did do an analysis to look at what some of the implications for displacement might be of these different land use scenarios and alternatives over time. So in the downtown area, we look at really 2 factors, right? When you think about displacement, you're looking at the magnitude of change, but also the rate of change that happens over time, because development that happens more quickly is more likely to cause displacement and gentrification, right? Because you won't have the time to get the policies in place and get the programs up and running. And so in the downtown area, as compared to other areas of the city, there's a little bit of growth that happens within the downtown area, particularly along the 101 corridor and around the Caltrain station. But it's a relatively low amount of growth as compared to the development that we're looking at accommodating in terms of housing in the Lindenville and east of 101 areas. So we talked about that, and I would recommend everyone, there's an analysis that's up on the Shape SSF website on the alternatives page that kind of breaks down what some of those implications would be. There's also the positive benefit of having new housing production within the city. The city has an inclusionary housing ordinance, so new housing would have some of that new housing would be available to lower income households. So there's there's both of those things happening at the same time.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and as Eric referenced earlier there, with the poll, we don't want you to worry at all. That poll is just really meant to be initial gut reaction. We're going to get much deeper into that conversation as we get into the small groups. And we're also going to have a survey that we're going to ask you to take that will tabulate a lot of those kind of input and results much more cleanly than that initial survey is. So don't be concerned about that at all. But moving forward, there's also a question about giving the community more space to be involved, asking that these changes are important for South San Francisco and why isn't there more space for community, given that for this meeting there's only about 50 folks that are participating. And we do have multiple avenues for input. This is one of many. As we mentioned earlier, there's also the surveys. We have 4 different sub-area meetings and a larger workshop that we held to provide more space to the community, but we're always looking for input of other creative ways during this time to get the community involved. So definitely keep us posted on that front. I really appreciate that comment. Eric, I don't know if you had anything else to add there before I move forward to the other questions. There's another question about what we're going to do to Cypress Park, which I think you got into a little bit earlier, Eric.
Yeah, so again, I'll say this again. None of the alternatives show a change to Cypress Park at all. So I just want to make sure that people recognize that fact. And as I showed earlier, and if you want to go check out the slides that are now posted on the Shape SSF website, you can see the slides and you can see how those parks were kind of obscured by the colorful land uses that are kind of over top of them. That was a mistake on our part, and we apologize, but there was no intent to redevelop those parks, and there's none in this, and we've cleaned up the maps and you can see all those parks on the downtown map. That said, we are looking for ideas for new open spaces in downtown, so not just maintaining what you have now, but thinking about what those new opportunities are. And so this is a real opportunity for us to look at those, look at where that new park and open space can be. And I'll just quickly answer one question in the chat that I saw pop up, which is about eminent domain. Nobody is talking about eminent domain in any of these scenarios.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I see about 20 more questions popping up, and we'll get through as many of these as we can, but I also just want to remind you, we are going to get in a smaller group, have more intimate discussion, come back to the larger group as well. But I'll take one of the question here is why did all the alternatives show high density housing where there are single family homes? And that's part of the eminent domain question that Eric referenced earlier. Definitely won't be part of this process at all, eminent domain. Again, these are just potential conceptual diagrams at this point to speak to how and where the city could potentially see change. Let me take this next one here. I understand housing needs in South San Francisco. However, downtown is a dense area and housing is new, and new high rises are unaffordable in trying to serve housing needs. May you please answer this question?
It's a really hard question to answer. And I don't think that's an issue just in South San Francisco. That's an issue Bay Area wide that we've been struggling with all over the region, all over the state, because cities haven't been producing housing in line with growth for jobs across the state and across the region. It's put all this upward pressure on rents for people in different housing across the city. At the same time, the region is going through this incredible transformation, and we're adding thousands and thousands of new jobs and new housing units. We've been doing it now for, well, since the last recession. And at this moment in time, like right up until the beginning of the pandemic, it was really complicated and hard to build affordable housing. It was really complicated and hard to build market rate housing because the demand for labor, the demand for resources, the construction materials, all of that had made it actually just very expensive to build housing. And so I think, you know, now that we're paused in this pandemic, I'm hopeful that some of the costs for some of these materials and labor might decline. It might make it a little easier to both build market rate housing, but also the affordable housing that we all need in our neighborhoods and communities, not just here in South San Francisco, but across the region.
Thanks for that, Eric. And there was a comment that high rises provide more housing than low density housing. That's why the existing low density housing all along the peninsula is so expensive. There's a question about how does the vision or alternatives incorporate South San Francisco's cultural and social history?
Mm-hmm. That's a terrific question. So I appreciate whoever asked it. I'd like to turn it around and think for you all to think about how the general plan can reflect that social and cultural history, not just in the land use alternatives, but also the policies that we develop and all the actions that the general plan lays out into the future. You know, there will certainly be some thought about historic preservation and those older properties that really reflect that heritage of the community, but that's only one viewpoint of the history of South San Francisco. And so we need to really be thinking about how to integrate that both in the cultural programming at community facilities, those new buildings that we build, really to reflect and celebrate that history and culture of the city.
Great, thank you, Eric. Let's see, there's a question that says, besides Cypress Park, are there any plans for Pine Lots, the green area, and Pine parking lot?
Well, we're not proposing any particular changes to those parcels. I don't know if the city has any specific plans for those in terms of rehabilitation or maintenance, but we can certainly ask some of the parks folks if they have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there was a follow-up thought of why doesn't the plan include improvements to the parks as well instead of no change at all?
Great. I think that's a great comment that we can add in and reflect as part of this discussion.
Let's see, any new thoughts here? So another suggestion is that none of the options or alternatives show low density housing. Therefore, is the city saying that it does not plan to keep single family homes?
I think I answered this question a little bit earlier, but I think, you know, there's that this kind of reflects what's there in the current and existing zoning for these areas. And it doesn't mean that these single family homes can't stay or can't be there into the future.
Thanks, Eric. And last one I'll take here. Why is the concentration of Old Town having to fulfill the housing need? ECR is well suited for high-rise buildings and is close to BART and Samtrans. Old Town is a dense area and could only take so much new construction without losing its historical value, livelihood, and peace of mind. May ECR be more of a focus for housing?
We are doing 4 sub-area meetings, we're doing 4 sub-area meetings. This is the second of those sub-area meetings over the next 2 weeks. We have ECR, so El Camino, and then also Lindenville will be happening on July the 28th, Lindenville at 1 p.m. and El Camino at 6 p.m. in the evening. I would encourage you to come to those meetings and or to fill out the surveys online. In all those 4 sub areas, we are looking at adding additional housing into all of those areas and not just into the downtown area. I will say we have really tried to think about where that growth goes, the amount of it across the city and how quickly it happens as part of this idea of the displacement analysis. And I'll say that within all those 4 areas that the amount of change happening, say in Lindenville and east of 101 is more significant than what's happening in downtown, and that there is a significant amount of housing that would be added into the El Camino corridor as per what's already been planned for in the future.
Great. With that, I think we should go ahead and move towards the small group exercise. Eric, do you want to pull up that slide that gives a quick synopsis? And as Eric is pulling up that slide, so we're now going to move to The next step is to break everyone up into small groups, and the easiest way to do that, I'll go ahead and create the groups and then randomly kind of distribute folks. And be patient with us. That might take 5 minutes or so to do that. But before we did that, and I'm hoping the interpreter is interpreting this, I wanted to ask the Spanish speaking members that have joined us here today, if you can use the raise your hand function. Again, it's at the bottom of your window, little blue hand, and or if you've called in, dial *9 to let us know if you would rather have that discussion by a Spanish-speaking facilitator. We can make sure that we have that available. So we'll give folks a few minutes to do that, and I'll let Eric read through this, and then I'm going to go ahead and once we get through these questions, Eric's going to read. I'm going to quickly work to distribute you all, and you'll see a little message pop up on your screen that'll ask you to gravitate into one of those rooms. So thank you again for your time.
And so while Dave's doing that, I'll just explain very quickly. We're essentially going to ask you 3 kind of overall questions while I stick you all into groups. The first is what you like and dislike about all the alternatives, because we want to know not just if you like, which is your preference or not, but really what you like and dislike about them. And then second, we're going to ask you what your preference is for them, but we want to know why you like the particular ones, because it's important for us to know the why, because we can mix and match and think about different things across the alternatives. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about priority area improvements or strategies. These can be things about housing or open space or any other topics that you want us to kind of address in the general plan update itself. So we'll have you talk about those. And then after we go through a kind of facilitated group discussion, we are going to have you fill out an online survey. Please fill it out and make sure at the very end you hit submit. So we're going to make sure to put those in the chats for the facilitators. So with that, I think Dave is already starting to stick people into, or about to start sticking people into those breakout rooms. So just bear with us for another minute or two while we all get into those rooms.
So we're just going to do a really quick wrap up here. I'm going to ask each facilitator from each group just to highlight the key themes that came out of the discussion, maybe which alternative that the group might have gravitated towards and or the discussion had around priorities. So with that, we'll just go down the board here. Eric and Troy, one of you is up. Eric, do you want to give us a quick synopsis of your group?
You got it. Yep, you got it. We didn't really gravitate towards any particular alternative. We had a lot of questions early on about understanding the difference between what's on the ground now and what's being proposed into the future. So there's a lot of discussion around that in our group. There was some good consensus around really kind of maintaining the cultural history of the area, particularly around the Old Town area and then downtown. So really keeping that core and kind of maintaining and preserving, protecting that area. Well, if we're adding higher density housing, we do it along the edges, either to the north along Airport or to the south along Colma Creek. And then we heard lots of good comments and conversations about things like improving open space, making sure we kind of highlight and illustrate that cultural history of the Old Town area as part of this planning process as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. Diana and Patricia, you were in the next group. Diana, do you want to give a quick snapshot, or you all, Rochambeau, whoever wants to give us a report out?
I can do it.
All right, Patricia, you're on.
So in our group, the gravitation was more towards alternative 2 and alternative 3. So people really liked having that connection to Colma Creek and the density and being able to connect to the nature there, being able to have also more of a connection with east of 101. And a lot of the discussion was around how can we have ownership options, giving alternatives for a variety of typology. So not just really big box, high rise, but something that's more with a lot of different options and that has a variety of density, and that maybe the high rise should not be condensed only to downtown, but maybe spread out through El Camino, and then also consider some of the high rise on east of 101, especially now as we are experiencing COVID and people having to, you know, be more closer to their work, and or maybe not all of the work dedicated to biotech, but the importance of creating more housing and how to do it in a way that's more balanced.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia. And I'll do a quick recap of our group. And I apologize again, we're going a couple minutes over, but if you can stay patient with us, we'll get through this and tell you a little about next steps. Our group also didn't necessarily gravitate toward any alternative. We did hear early on that folks were interested in keeping it maybe a lower density within the downtown area, but then we also heard a balanced need of potential housing that will allow for some affordability. Whatever happens, the preservation of the history and culture in the area was vastly important to the group, meaning everything from the history that's there, but also preserving the parks and allowing for improvement and growth of those areas. And as development, or if development happens, making sure that we anticipate the impact on schools and infrastructure and other needs moving forward. There's a lot of conversation about how residential or increased densities could happen around the BART station, along the ECR, or other areas generally around town as well, to kind of spread out some of those potential impacts. There was also a lot of talk about parking and potential parking impacts, but I'm also realizing that with new advancements in electrification of Caltrains and public transit options, and others, that folks might actually end up going car-free, which could balance some of that impact. And most of all, I mean, people really came to the city because of the diversity and culture and history, and want to do everything they can, recognizing a lot of that is in downtown, to really preserve that. That was the main message we heard loud and clear from our group. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric and ask you to share your screen to talk just real quickly about next steps, where we go from here, other opportunities to come out and share your voice, and then we'll wrap this up and let you go on your way. So Eric, back to you.
Thanks, Dave. And just very quickly, I'll get you out of here in about a minute. We just want to let you know that we want to hear from you, your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors. So please share information about the upcoming meetings. And then online, we have a series of resources that are available to help navigate all of this really complicated information at shapessf.net/alternatives. There's information about upcoming meetings. There's kind of primer or background videos. There's land use maps and all the descriptions, and then there's links to these surveys, both in English and in Spanish. There's these 4 surveys for El Camino, Lindenville, downtown, east of 101, and then also citywide as well. We have, this is the list of kind of engagement that's ongoing around the alternatives. Next week on Tuesday, the 28th, we have a meeting around the Lindenville sub-area. So that will be from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. And then in the evening on the 28th, we'll have a meeting on the El Camino sub-area. So that'll be from 6 to 8 in the evening. And then we're scheduled to have a planning commission and city council study session to kind of share what we've heard during all of these discussions over the last month. And then all the online surveys, we'll be sharing it with them at that moment in time. And then finally, just one last plug, go to shapessf.net in general. We have a lot of great resources on the process, a lot of background materials. All the information from our past meetings are up there, so you can see what people said at all those past meetings, as well as this round of community engagement. And then I'll just say, lastly, I really appreciate all of the conversation and comments tonight. We got a lot of really great feedback. I know in my group, and we talked about some issues, and we didn't necessarily resolve all those issues tonight, but we appreciate that everyone came, shared their ideas with us, and were open and honest about what they thought about the land use alternatives and how we could kind of meet that vision for the city of South San Francisco. So thanks again for everyone for joining us tonight, and we really appreciate it and hope to see you at one of the upcoming meetings. Thank you.
Good night, all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.